The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when they pulled into my driveway. I was just finishing up the last watering of the hibiscus and petunias, the morning air still cool against my skin. The kids, my granddaughter and grandson, raced each other to the van, squealing about who got the window seat. My son and daughter-in-law moved with that practiced bustle of parents on a mission, backpacks, beach towels, sunscreen cooler. It looked like any other family departure you might glimpse through a passing car window. But when they paused at the front step, my heart tightened. "Mom," my son called out, his smile faintly shadowed by the rush of packing, "you're too old for long flights. Just watch the house." His words landed flat like a book slammed shut in my chest, and I felt that old familiar flicker of something I'd learned to swallow long ago, that my place was here, rooted in routines no longer meant to include me. My daughter-in-law leaned out the passenger window, her voice light but firm. "Water, the plants, double-lock the doors. Please, don't worry about anything else." She sounded more like a supervisor ticking off chores than a family member offering a break. They didn't glance back at me, didn't see the tightness around my eyes or the quiver in my hands. They were already exchanging last-minute travel tips, which beaches were calmer in September, which seaside taverna served the best grilled octopus. They climbed in the engine's rumble, swallowed by laughter and the kids' excited chatter. I stood at the curb, a watering can still in one hand, the other idle at my side. I didn't call out, "Wait." I didn't remind them of the stories my husband told about Greece or the Mediterranean holidays we once dreamed of together. I didn't demand to be counted. Instead, I simply waved, the polite wave of a grandmother who had practiced making herself small. Their van pulled away, backfiring once as it accelerated down the street. My view filled with the rising dust, and then the van's black flank gleaming under the sun, until finally, even the dust settled, and the memory of their laughter drifted off into the morning. I stood there, the weight of my apron tipping forward, and wondered when I had become invisible, when the woman who spent decades keeping this home running, who raised a son and poured her life into every holiday and birthday, was reduced to the caretaker of a lawn and a few potted blooms. It took a moment before I noticed how silent the house had become behind me. No sound of shouted goodbyes, no last-minute reminders to pack extra snacks, no slam of a final trunk lid. Even the birds seemed to hush as the van rounded the corner, leaving nothing behind but the echo of spinning tires. I set the watering can down on the stoop with deliberate gentleness, as if I were laying a sleeping child in its crib. The droplets on the petals caught the light, trembling like tiny diamonds. And I felt that same tremor inside me. I didn't cry. My tears had long since learned to stay somewhere behind my ribs, too polite even to escape the corners of my eyes. I didn't stomp my foot or slam the door. That type of scene seemed more suited to a play than to my life. Instead, I turned and walked slowly back toward the front door, each step measured, each thought clear. I would water the plants. I would lock the doors twice. I would do exactly as they asked, and then I would decide what I wanted to do next. Inside, I slipped off my sandals and padded into the kitchen, the tile cool underfoot. I set a kettle on the stove and filled it with water, hearing the click and hiss as it heated. In the quiet, I found my pulse again, just the steady thump in my wrist, reminding me I was alive. I reached for my favorite teacup, the one with the tiny blue forget-me-nots painted around the rim. A legacy gift from my mother. I'd saved it for mornings that called for comfort. Today qualified. While the kettle steamed, I went outside again to finish the watering I'd abandoned. I moved deliberately from pot to pot, roses, ferns, tiny succulents, tending each as though it were a living thing with hopes and fears of its own. I murmured encouragement under my breath. "Steady now," I'd say to the begonias. "Don't drown to the ferns." The act was soothing, a ritual I performed long before the van arrived, and I clung to it now as a reminder of my own quiet strength. When the tea was ready, I carried the cup back to the living room and settled into my favorite armchair by the window, where late afternoon light would filter in through lace curtains. I wrapped my hands around the warm porcelain and breathed in the herbal scent. It felt like an anchor grounding me in a moment of dislocation. Outside the window, the yard looked peaceful green and well-tended. Inside the house smelled of lemon polish and old books. I let my mind drift to memories, the laughter of my husband as he pulled a grapevine from the soil, the squeals of my children chasing each other through the sprinklers, birthday parties, where I stood in the kitchen doorway watching friends and family circle the table I'd so lovingly decorated. I remembered how it felt to be counted on, needed, even celebrated. It was nearly unbelievable that today my family thought of me only as a placeholder. I finished my tea, sip by sip, letting the warmth spread from my chest outward. I didn't plan. My life had worn the lines of routines and obligations for so long that spontaneity felt foreign. But within that silence, I sensed a stirring, a question I hadn't asked in decades. What if they were wrong? What if I wasn't too old for long flights or for new adventures or for being seen? The house remained still as I set the cup on its saucer and walked slowly from room to room. I ran my hand along the banister where I'd guided my son's small palms. I peered into the guest room closet where the old suitcases slept, gathering dust. In the bedroom, I paused beside the dresser where my mother's silver comb still lay in the velvet tray. Each object felt like a word in a half-forgotten language, waiting for me to speak its meaning again. By the time I returned to the window seat, the late light had deepened to dusky gold. The horizon glowed behind the oaks, promising evening. The kettle was empty now, spirits of steam dissipated. My tea was cold, but I didn't mind. I let amber rings stain the saucer, evidence of a morning's comfort. They had driven off with their laughter and their plans. I was left with the hush of an empty house and the steady rhythm of my own breath. And in that hush, I felt a gentle but undeniable resolve settling in my chest. I would watch the house, yes, but I would also watch myself. And I might just discover I had a future far larger than their narrow expectations. Long after the last glow of sunlight faded from the lawn, I stayed by the window, gazing at the darkening sky. The garden watered and waiting seemed to nod in agreement. Sometimes being asked to stay behind is not a cage, but a chance to decide where you truly belong. And tonight, in the soft quiet of my own choosing, I began to realize I was far too alive and far too young at heart to remain invisible any longer. I woke to the soft chirp of sparrows outside my bedroom window and the lingering haze of yesterday's disappointment still clinging to my bones. The kitchen clock ticked gently, the air smelled faintly of jasmine from the teapot I'd left steeping overnight, and for a moment I let myself believe it was any other ordinary morning. Then I remembered the van, their laughter ringing down the driveway, the finality in my son's words, "Too old for long flights." My pulse stuttered, and I slid out of bed, slipping on my slippers and tugging my robe tight around me. I walked to the mailbox out by the curb, the grass still wet with dawn's dew, and I saw the thick envelope tucked in among the usual bills and circulars. At first, I hesitated, reluctant to touch yet another reminder that they'd planned a trip without me. But the cornflower blue edge of a travel agency logo peeked out, and I realized with a pinch of that familiar ache that it couldn't be anything else. I brought it inside and set it on the counter, the weight of it surprising, like holding someone else's secret. The kitchen felt too bright, the walls too bare. I flicked on the kettle and reached for my favorite teacup, the one with the tiny forget-me-nots painted around its rim, a gift from my mother years ago. My hands shook as I measured the tea, the unsteady tremor reminding me of how long I'd been silenced. I let the water boil steam, curling like a question mark, and poured it over the leaves. The scent of chamomile rose in a soft cloud, and I wrapped both hands around the warm cup, trying to anchor myself. After the first sip, I felt the tremor ease, if only a little. I looked at the envelope again. It was thick enough for 4 passenger tickets, 2 adults, 2 children. Destination Athens. Departure in 3 days. I lifted a corner of the flap and saw the rows of empty passenger fields, their names filled in neatly seats together, and mine blank. It felt momentous, as if the envelope carried not just their tickets, but their unstated decision to leave me behind. I set the tea down, reached for the envelope, and peeled it open slowly. Out slid 4 crisp tickets, still unstamped, a silent reminder that travel plans are fragile until they're sealed. My breath shuddered through my chest, but no tears came. Instead, a quiet curiosity took hold, a soft insistence that this moment didn't have to end in quiet resignation. I brewed another cup of tea, the kettle's whistle sharper this time, and carried both mugs into the living room. I perched on the edge of my well-worn armchair, cradling the tickets in one hand, the warm mug in the other. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting a lattice of light and shadow across the hardwood floor. Paul's photograph on the mantel, him smiling younger than he'd ever be again, seemed to watch me with gentle encouragement. His eyes in that frame felt like a nudge. You've been rooted here long enough. It was time to decide what to do next. I stared at the tickets for a long while. In the silence, I could nearly hear their footsteps. As they'd packed and loaded the van, the echo of their laughter fading with each mile. But I also felt something unexpected: space. Space to think, to plan, to choose. My savings account had a balance that could cover an unexpected trip. My passport lay in a drawer in the hallway, still valid for another 2 years. My responsibilities here: bills paid, plants watered. The dog walked, could be entrusted to a neighbor. Nothing held me hostage but my own unspoken agreement to stay small. My hands stopped shaking when I picked up the phone. I dialed the number on the corner of the agency's letterhead, the voice on the other end polite and professional. "Travel agency, how may I help?" she asked. My voice felt steadier than I expected. "Yes, hello. I'd like to cancel 4 tickets, Athens, departure in 3 days. Confirmation number." I read off the code fastened at the bottom of the stub. "May I ask why, ma'am?" the agent said, surprise or maybe concern tinting her tone. I paused, bracing for the old well of because they forgot me or because I'm not welcome. But none of that fit. Instead, I said, "No, that's fine. Just cancel them, please." My voice held no trace of apology or embarrassment, just the crisp clarity of someone reclaiming her choices. There was a breath on the line. "Of course, ma'am, they've been canceled." She read back the confirmation, and I wrote it on a scrap of paper before placing the tickets beside the teacup on the arm of the chair. The kettle whistled again, my 3rd cup, but I didn't care. I finished the line of tea, letting its warmth seep into my chest. Then I set the cup down and looked around the room. My living room had always been my sanctuary, the quilt draped over the back of the sofa, the bookshelf packed with old novels and photo albums, the piano in the corner collecting a thin layer of dust. Today, the silence felt different, charged with possibility. I rose and walked through the rooms, touching the chipped ceramic bowl on the dining table where I laid out Sunday breakfast, the stack of board games where I'd played with grandchildren, the window ledges crowned with potted ivy and succulents. Finally, I stopped at the guest room door and pushed it open. Inside lay the empty suitcases, too well packed at Christmas and forgotten ever since. I opened the top one and ran my hand over its interior, felt its promise of distant cities and fresh air. A suitcase is just a thing. You fill it with clothes, with necessities, with hopes you dare to own. I closed the case and turned away. Outside, the sun was higher now, the morning slipping toward noon. I felt a soft thrill in my chest. For the first time in a long while, I was considering a journey that wasn't dictated by obligation or courtesy. My heart, which had grown accustomed to waiting for permission, felt strangely impatient. I poured the last of the kettle into a travel mug and slipped it into my bag along with my wallet and keys. I found my passport in the drawer, its cover worn at the edges, its pages stamped with memories even older. I slipped it into my coat pocket and then checked the mailbox keys. The envelope with their canceled tickets went back into the mailbox. I wouldn't need them, but I kept them there as proof that I'd been both erased and empowered in a single morning. I stepped outside and locked the door behind me. The sun was warm on my face and the world smelled of jasmine and freshly mown grass. I looked up the street quiet as if holding its breath, waiting for what came next. Then I walked to the phone box by the neighbor's house and pressed the speed dial for Carol. When she answered, I said, "Carol, could you water my plants for a few days?" Her surprised. Going somewhere floated through the line, but I only laughed softly. "Just a little trip," I said, and hung up. I rolled my suitcase to the curb, took a deep breath of September's promise, and looked back at the house that had held me for decades. It felt different now, more like a home base than a cage. In my bag, the travel mug was half full of tea, and I carried nothing else but the bright clarity of my own choice. I didn't yet know where I'd go or what I'd do, but I savored the moment I discovered that the invitation I'd been waiting for was the one I issued to myself. The plane tickets to Athens, once a symbol of exclusion, lay quietly canceled. But in their place, I felt the stirrings of an unopened invitation, an adventure unclaimed, waiting only for me. And as the door closed softly behind me, I realized the only ticket I needed was the one I booked in my mind, and soon in the sky itself. I sank into my favorite armchair, the one upholstered in faded rose brocade, that still held the imprint of my body after all these years. The late afternoon light slanted through the lace curtains and settled on the mantelpiece, where Paul's photograph stood in its silver frame, him, as I remembered, laughing, cradling a newborn in his arms, the same twinkle in his eyes that first made me fall in love. I stared at that face for a moment, feeling the quiet encouragement he always offered, like he was leaning in across the decades to say, "Go on, Helen. It's your turn now." Beside the photograph, my passport lay open on the edge of the armrest table, the navy blue booklet nearly forgotten until this morning's revelation. I flipped through the crisp pages, each stamp a little talisman of memories, London in spring, when we were young, and carefree Paris for our 20th anniversary Rome with the kids high on gelato and gelid fountains. The cover closed with a satisfying snap reminding me that I could still cross borders, still chase horizons. I reached for my checkbook and ledger, laid them on my lap, and traced the numbers in my savings register. $12,000 more if I included the bonds tucked away in the safety deposit box at the bank. No mortgages, no loans, no children relying on me. For the first time in years, I was carrying nothing but my own name and the quiet weight of decisions left undone. I closed my eyes and let that truth settle in. I owed no one an explanation for where I chose to go next. The phone's gentle ring startled me out of my reverie. It was Carol, my next-door neighbor. "Did you need those plants watered?" she asked, voice bright despite the late hour. "If you're going away," she teased, "you finally get to see the world without us tagging along." I laughed, a genuine, liberating laugh that felt like it released a lock deep in my chest. "Yes," I answered and watched as a grin spread across my face. "I am, actually. Would you mind taking care of them for a few days?" I gave her the dates, and she promised she'd keep them safe. I thanked her, hung up, and felt the energy in my living room shift. I stood and moved across the room to the old secretary desk, where I keep my address book, that leather-bound relic from the 70s, lined with appointments and anniversaries. Many crossed out, a few dates penciled in for grandchildren's birthdays. I opened it to a clean page and jotted down the name of the travel agency, then paused. My hand hovered above the desk, the pen suspended between possibility and fear. But the fear felt small, more like a distant echo than a chain around my ankles. Here in my living room, with the sunlight fading to gold, I realized I had let myself be held back for far too long. I poured another cup of tea, this time ginger and lemon, and carried it back to my armchair. I curled my legs beneath me, wrapping my feet in the soft wool of my favorite slippers, and closed my eyes against the soft hiss of the kettle. With each sip, I rehearsed the words I would say to the agent. "1 ticket to Athens, please. Just me." I pictured the itinerary spread out before me. Departure Wednesday afternoon, direct flight, window seat. I could almost taste the sea air on the Aegean, the tang of salt on my tongue, the ancient columns bathed in the rosy light of dusk. When I opened my eyes, I lifted the phone and dialed. My heart fluttered, though not with anxiety, something more like anticipation. A friendly voice answered, and I said it. No apologies, no explanations. "I'd like 1 ticket to Athens, departing 3 days from now, please." The agent clicked on her keyboard, repeated the details, and I gave her my credit card number without flinching. I was solid and sure, a woman reclaiming her own story. The confirmation number hummed through my fingers like a secret code unlocking a long-sealed door. I hung up and set the phone down, feeling a warm bubble of triumph rise in my chest. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and let it settle there. The exhilaration of choice, the flicker of a dream turned plan. I stared at the photograph of Paul again, and in that silver frame, I saw more than a happy memory. I saw possibility. His quiet smile seemed to urge me onward. Go, love. See it all. Sunlight slipped away, and the room darkened around the edges, but I felt lit from within. I stood and padded to the front door, the hardwood cool under my slippers, and stepped onto the porch. The ivy clung to the brick columns, and the garden lay peaceful in the dusk. No sign yet of Carol's watering can set by the back gate, but I trusted her to brighten the plants in my absence. I closed the door softly behind me and looked up at the sky, now streaked with lavender and peach. 3 days until I'd exchange this quiet street for the bustle of Athens' airport, until I would find myself among strangers and stories waiting to be shared. 3 days until I breathed in a new world. I raised my chin to the fading light and whispered to no one in particular, "Here I come." Inside, I switched on a small lamp by the stairs, casting a pool of golden glow around the foyer. I checked my passport once more, felt its ridged spine under my fingers, and placed it gently on the shelf where all departures begin. I hung my keys by the hook, no need to lock them yet, and let my coat rest on the rack ready for packing. Then I poured a final cup of tea and returned to the armchair. My living room felt different now, more like a launch pad than a cage. I lifted the mug and inhaled its citrus tang warmth, imagining it as the first of many new tastes I'd savor. Greek coffee at a sidewalk cafe, olives picked from sun-baked hills, honey-soaked pastries that melted like morning light. The dreams I'd kept folded inside me were unfurling, each one setting a spark in my chest. I didn't rush to pack or plan any further tonight. Instead, I let the calm confidence wash over me. At 72, I had years of quiet strength in my bones, decades of care and sacrifice etched into my hands. But now, for a few days, those hands would hold nothing but a passport and the wheel of a carry-on. No one else's itinerary lay between these pages. I closed my eyes and rested my head back, picturing the Parthenon's silhouette against the dawn, feeling the thrill of being exactly where I chose to be. By the time I set the teacup down and the last light winked out of the sky, I knew I had crossed an invisible threshold. The envelope of their canceled tickets lay on my desk, a monument to an old life. And in its place stood the glow of a new plan, 1 seat, my name on it, and a horizon that waited only for me. Tomorrow I would pack. Tomorrow I would shop for a scarf. Tomorrow I would write Paul a letter in my heart. But tonight I simply breathed in that sweet quiet of dreams awakened and let myself believe it was never too late to begin again. The dawn light crept through the living room window just as I finished my second cup of tea. I stood up with a quiet satisfaction, the first real motion of a day I'd been both dreading and longing for. My suitcase stood open on the bed, half-packed the night before, soft cotton dresses, my favorite navy scarf, that little packet of emergency toiletries I always swore I'd remember, but somehow never did. I zipped the bag closed, lifted it onto its wheels, and wheeled it to the front door. I paused there for a moment, hand on the doorknob, listening to the soft hush of the house. The morning was hushed in a way that felt almost sacred. No children racing down the street, no neighbor's dog barking, only the hum of my own breath and the weight of my decision settling around me. I double-checked my purse, wallet, boarding pass, passport, prescription, sunglasses. Everything I needed to step outside the life I knew and into the one I chose. On the porch, the air was crisp, the ivy by the steps still damp from overnight dew. I inhaled deeply, savoring that cool freshness, and remembered the face of my mother calling me inside when I was a child, how she'd told me to sear moments into my memory. With a final nod to the house that had sheltered me for nearly 73 years, I locked the door and slipped the key into my bag. No turning back. The taxi ride to the airport felt surreal, the city unfolding like a movie in slow motion. Streetlights still glowed, gold shops were just flicking on their neons, and a man in a suit sprinted past us, briefcase in hand. I watched the sun lift higher, rising with a promise I had almost forgotten after decades of standing still. I felt buoyant, lighter than I had in years, as if my suitcase didn't hold clothes and essentials, but a newfound freedom. When the taxi pulled up at the departure's entrance, I paid the fare with a smile and grabbed my bag. The automatic door slid open and the airport swallowed me in its bright, echoing vastness. A tide of travelers swept around me, families saying heartfelt goodbyes, business folks thumbing through briefcases and boarding passes, couples leisurely rolling designer luggage. For a heartbeat, I hesitated, old fears flickering. Was I out of place? Too old? Too out of practice? Then I remembered the morning I honored myself by booking this flight, and those doubts vanished like dust in sunlight. Check-in was simple. The young man behind the counter glanced at my ID and boarding pass, stamped it, and handed it back with a polite, "Have a safe flight, ma'am." No fuss, no question, just the efficient hum of a machine doing its job. I slipped through security with a smooth nod and stepped onto the other side, where the air smelled faintly of coffee and duty-free perfume. Gate C12 was already buzzing with activity chairs, filled people leaning on carry-ons, earbuds in place, eyes fixed on screens, or the bustle around them. I found my gate, spotted the sign showing my flight number and destination, and felt a thrill in my chest. I had arrived. I found an empty spot by the row of seats, draped my coat across the aisle seat, and sat down on the window side. My boarding pass felt heavy and reassuring in my hand, as though it were a shield against all the times I'd been told I didn't belong. Moments later, a gate agent appeared, clipboard in hand, scanning names. When she reached my turn, she offered that practiced smile so familiar to anyone traveling alone, the one that says, "I see you're brave, but maybe a bit out of your element." But I bristled no more. Instead, I returned her smile, steady and sure. "Thank you," I said, tucking the pass back into my purse and giving her a reassuring nod. She moved on to the next passenger, and I watched her go, feeling more at home in that hum of hustle than I had in any church or family gathering over the past year. Surveying the gate area, I noticed a young family struggling with strollers and carry-ons, a lone businessman tapping away on his laptop, and a group of teenagers laughing over trip photos on their phones. Everyone seemed to belong to their own bubble of concern or excitement. I sipped the bottled water I'd brought and realized I too had my own bubble now, the journey ahead. I let the moment stretch out as suspension in time before we all moved toward the plane. Now boarding rows 12 through 20, the agent called her voice smooth over the intercom. I clicked my seatbelt buckle in the empty aisle seat as people rose and gathered their things. My heart thumped a little faster when I stood and lifted my bag, passing it into the overhead bin with a confident click. The cabin felt quieter than the gate, more intimate, like stepping into someone's living room rather than a metal tube hurtling through the skies. I took my seat, settled my carry-on under the seat ahead, and sat back. The window beside me framed a row of red tail fins, little arrows pointing toward new beginnings. I draped my coat across the center armrest, folding it so it wouldn't crowd my passenger. I didn't need a neighbor. This solitude was part of the gift I'd given myself. As the flight attendant slid past with a clipboard, she offered me another practiced smile. "Long trip today?" she asked, her tone casual but kind. I clutched my boarding pass, the worn edges soft beneath my fingers. "Long enough," I replied, and she nodded knowingly before moving on down the aisle. I watched her go, then settled my gaze on the window once more. They called for final boarding, and I heard the last passengers file in. The stewardess clicked, the overhead bins closed, and the pilot's voice crackled over the speakers. "Welcome aboard, folks. We'll be taxiing shortly." The engines hummed to life with a low, confident rumble and all too familiar lullaby. I closed my eyes against the overhead reading light and let that rumble resonate through me. Above the din of conversations, the occasional baby's cry, and the rustle of snack bags, I felt a calm certainty. Pretending I belonged here in this mix of stories and destinations was indeed half the battle. And today, as the last bolt of sunlight glimmered off the wingtip, I realized I had already won. The plane rolled forward, bumping gently as we joined the line of takeoff traffic. My knuckles, which had once trembled with uncertainty, now rested steady on my lap. I thought of all the mornings I'd spent waiting for permission to speak to travel, to take up space. Those days were behind me. Today, I had claimed my space in the sky, my passage to a world that had once seemed too vast, too unforgiving for someone my age. We reached the runway, paused, and then accelerated, the roar of the engines lifting me off the ground. My heart soared with the plane as it climbed through layers of atmosphere, each foot higher, freeing me more from the gravity of past expectations. I peered through the window, watching houses shrink and fields blur into patchwork, feeling every mile dissolve the memories of being left behind. When we leveled off and the seatbelt sign dimmed, I exhaled the last of my hesitation. The clouds stretched out below like a sea of cotton, and I leaned my forehead against the cool glass to press my face against the sky. The stewardess appeared, offering snacks and drinks. I asked for water, but then caught her eye and asked, "Do you ever get tired of the hum of engines?" She smiled, surprised by the personal question. "Never," she replied. "Every flight brings a new sky." I returned her smile, finding companionship in her answer. As she moved on, I settled back, closed my eyes, and let the steady pitch of the engines cradle me. The seat beside me remained gently empty, a reminder that I didn't need to wait for an invitation to claim this journey. I had booked my own ticket, shielded by my boarding pass and buoyed by my choice. Up here above the worries and the weight of unseen roles, I was exactly where I belonged. In the hush between the mechanical breath of the engines and the soft rustle of blankets in the overhead compartments, I thought of tomorrow's sunrise over Athens. I imagined stepping into a new city, my feet on unfamiliar pavement, my heart open to stories waiting to be told. And as the plane sailed westward into the bright blue sky, I knew that whatever awaited me on the ground, I had already accomplished the greatest journey of all, the one back to myself. The taxi dropped me at a narrow side street just outside the heart of Athens, where the heat hit me like a warm blanket as soon as I stepped onto the pavement. My suitcase wheels whispered over the uneven stones, and I let them guide me toward the modest pension I'd chosen at random. A small sign above the door simply read, "Nereida's house," in sun-faded letters. Inside, the air was cool enough to make me sigh in relief, and a kindly woman with soft, silver-streaked hair welcomed me with a curtsy and a single word, "Madam." My room was small but spotless, painted a pale shade of seafoam green with a single window that framed a view of tiled rooftops stretching toward the Acropolis, perched high on its rocky hill. I set my bag down on the twin bed, its coverlet thin and embroidered with simple flowers. A gentle breeze stirred the white curtains, carrying the faint aroma of jasmine from a courtyard below. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the quiet sink in, as though I'd woken in someone else's dream and realized I didn't need to chase it. By the time I felt ready to leave the pension, The sun had climbed high, turning the city into a mosaic of golden light and deep shadows. I folded my scarf around my neck for a little protection, though the warmth was welcome, and began to stroll unhurried down the narrow lanes. The streets were peaceful at midday, shutters half closed, laundry flapping gently in the sunlight, a few locals pausing to sip small cups of Greek coffee under the olive green awnings of cafes. No one hurried. There was an unspoken agreement that the day belonged to the sun, and we simply walked within its embrace. I paused outside a small bakery whose windows were fogged by the oven's warmth. Fresh loaves rested in wicker baskets, pillowy doughy bugazza, and crusty loaves with sesame seed crowns. A handful of olives gleamed in a shallow dish, glistening as though they'd been polished by angels. When the baker, a young man with flour-dusted black curls, caught my eye, I tried my best Greek kalimera, which earned me a warm nod and a polite smile. Bugazza and black olives, please, I said, pointing and hoping my accent wouldn't betray me. He handed me a paper bag and a small plate, then wrapped my purchases with practiced efficiency. When I stepped back onto the street, I found a bench in a shaded nook beneath a lemon tree. I tore into the bread first. The pastry layers flaked apart, revealing softly sweet custard within the contrast of textures at once comforting and thrilling. I popped an olive into my mouth, savoring its briny richness, and let myself close my eyes against the light. No phone buzzed in my pocket. No message demanding updates or excuses. I sat there, simply breathing each exhale, carrying away the weight of obligations I'd carried for years. For the first time since I could remember, I existed without definition. No mother, no grandmother, no caretaker. Just a traveler, tasting morning in a new city. When my bread and olives were gone, I tucked the empty bag into my purse and continued my walk. I followed cobblestone alleys that wound upward branches of bougainvillea, brushing overhead in vivid magenta splashes. I passed a tiny church with chipped white walls and a single bell. The door hung ajar, and inside a single beam of sunlight lit a row of votive candles. No one was there but the dust motes dancing in the beam. I lingered for a moment, stepping inside to light a candle of my own, a simple prayer of gratitude for the chance to stand alone and see what the world might show me. The climb grew steeper as I drew closer to the foot of the ancient Acropolis. Tourists waited in line for guided tours, cameras swinging from their necks, but I bypassed the crowds. Instead, I found a narrow path leading to a viewpoint, a spot where the city sprawled out behind me, the navy blue sea shimmering in the distance. I sat on a low stone wall, rested my elbows on my knees, and drank in the panorama, broken columns, silhouetted against the sky, the theater of Dionysus below, and the endless white of the city spreading toward the shore. A gentle breeze carried the distant hum of traffic and the clink of cafe dishes down from the streets. I remembered the afternoons I'd sat in my own living room poring over travel brochures, with the kids circling places we never managed to visit. Here I was, by fate or stubborn choice, living one of those afternoons for myself. I felt a thrill, like I'd slipped through a seam in time and found the life I'd tucked away in the folds of routine. Eventually, hunger nudged me back down the hill. At a sidewalk cafe, shaded by a broad striped awning, I found an empty chair at a corner table. A waiter soon appeared, offering a menu scrawled in chalk on a blackboard propped against the wall. Fresh salads, grilled fish, moussaka, and a cheese plate dotted with olives. I ordered a Greek salad and a glass of cool water, then leaned back, letting the shade cool my skin. The salad arrived in a riot of color: ruby red tomatoes, crisp green cucumbers, rings of purple onion, and creamy wedges of feta drizzled in bright oil and sprinkled with oregano. I savored each bite, feeling the flavors awaken every corner of my mouth. Around me, people leaned in close to their companions, talking softly or reading quietly, the overall hum of life a gentle lullaby. I glimpsed a mother feeding her toddler, an elderly couple, sharing a plate of fish, a trio of friends comparing notes on their Greek lessons. I felt no need to be anywhere but here. After lunch, I walked without purpose. I passed small shops selling hand-painted plates, leather sandals, and woven rugs. I stopped at an outdoor market where local vendors hawked herbs and spices, their voices rising in cheerful calls. I inhaled the scent of dried oregano, basil, and cinnamon, feeling it weave into my own life's tapestry. At one stall, an old man offered me a sprig of rosemary, pressing it into my hand with a grin. I thanked him, marveling at the kindness of strangers in a place far from home. By mid-afternoon, the sun began its slow descent, mellowing the light and easing the heat. I found my way back to the pension, the path lit by the warm glow of street lamps and the soft haze of dust dancing in the shrinking daylight. In my room, I sat by the window, with the shutter open, watching laundry drifting on the line across the alley like a slow parade of ghosts and memories. I let the rumble of distant traffic and the murmur of late strollers carry me toward a quiet peace. No nightly calls from home cut through the calm, no demands for news or apologies. Even the photo of Paul on the mantel seemed to smile in quiet approval, as if he understood the miracle of stillness I'd allowed myself. Here in Athens, I was neither young nor old, just free to wander, to linger, and to be unseen. I poured myself a small glass of wine I'd picked up earlier, a local white called Asirtiko, crisp and mineral. I carried it to the balcony and let the cool air wash over me as I sipped. The scent of jasmine and lemon trees drifted through the street below, mingling with the last notes of church bells tolling in the distance. I closed my eyes and let the city's heartbeat sync with my own. In that moment, I realized how long it had been since I'd moved this slowly with no agenda and no one to please. Each step, each bite, each breath had become an affirmation that life could still surprise me, that I could stand among these ancient stones and still feel wholly alive. And when at last I climbed into bed that night, I slept with the window ajar, the city's lullaby at my back, and the quiet freedom of solitude cradling me close. I woke the next morning in the pension to the gentle clatter of dishes from the small dining room down the hall. The soft hum of an answering guest greeting drifted through my open door. I pulled on a cotton blouse, smoothed my scarf into place, and slipped into the corridor where the air smelled faintly of warmed bread and strong coffee. At the long wooden table by the window, I found a basket of pastries, a swirl of honey-drenched kataifi crisp triangles of spanakopita and fresh fruit. A carafe of dark coffee stood beside plates of olives, tomatoes, and feta. I poured a cup and settled into an empty seat between a lone traveler reading a guidebook and a woman with silver hair who looked up from a black and white sketch she was drawing. "Good morning," I offered, setting down my coffee. Her eyes flicked up, sharp, intelligent, and her thin lips curved into a smile. "Good morning," she replied, her voice gentle but firm, like sunlight filtering through a window. She gestured at the seat. "Join me." I nodded, introduced myself, and we began to exchange the perfunctory pleasantries that travelers do. Our names, where we hailed, from which flights had brought us here. "I'm Rosalie," she said, tucking a loose strand of silver hair behind her ear. "Retired school principal, now retired full stop." I laughed at her matter-of-fact phrasing already. She felt like someone who knew exactly what she wanted from life. I told her my own name and the broad strokes of how I'd come to Athens, a canceled family trip, a stubborn booking for one. She raised an eyebrow in expression of approval and said, "Ah, reclaiming your story. I'm all for that." Over the next hour, as the pension's small dining room filled with travelers, Rosalie and I exchanged stories. She showed me her sketch, a view of the Acropolis rendered with swift, confident strokes. She explained how she'd come to Greece to honor her late husband's dream of seeing the Parthenon, but had decided to stay longer than planned. He always said, "Don't just visit a place, get to know it," she quoted. So here I am, getting to know Athens. I felt a rush of kinship. Like me, she'd traveled not just to walk through foreign streets, but to belong, even if only for a little while. By mid-morning, we left the pension together, drawn toward the labyrinth of Plaka's hidden alleys. Rosalie pointed out things I had missed on my solo meander, tiny mosaic tiles embedded in crumbling walls, a wrought iron balcony festooned with geraniums, a weathered sign above a door that read, "Since 1897." She paused before a neglected shop where chipped plates were stacked in dusty windowsills. "This," she said, "is where the real story hides." She pressed her sketchbook into my hands, inviting me to draw alongside her. I balked. My sketches had always been stick figures, but she simply smiled and said, "No judgments here." We settled on low stone steps. The sun dappled through wisteria vines overhead and drew for a while in companionable silence. The only sounds are pencil scratching and a distant accordion player in the square. When she laid down her sketch and examined mine, a rough outline of a doorway, I expected critique. Instead, she nodded approvingly. "You see the doorway," she said. "Most people walk right past." Our shared mornings continued as we roamed the city. We discovered a cafe where the waiters poured wine from clay jugs, the cups so small the wine tasted concentrated and bright. We sipped beneath a vine-draped terrace, savoring the liberal generosity of the Greek poor and watching locals drift in for their daily gossip. Rosalie knew every face, every story, introducing me to the cafe owner as a fellow wanderer. She laughed when I tried my Greek bravo, she exclaimed, and we toasted to accidental friendships. She showed me quiet corners of the National Archaeological Museum where we lingered by statues of forgotten gods. We paused at the Roman agora's pillars, resting in the shade of plane trees. When I marveled that I'd never seen these places with unhurried eyes, she shrugged. "Life's most vivid colors appear when you slow down," she said. One afternoon, we climbed to the top of a rooftop bar that overlooked the city. The Acropolis loomed before us, dusted in the pink haze of sunset. I asked how she knew to find such hidden spots. "Instinct," she replied, "and decades of refusing to stay in the obvious." She offered me a slice of orange lacquered with honey from a nearby stand, and I bit into the fruit, the sweetness startling on my tongue. We watched the lights blink to life across the city lamps, in windows, neon signs in alleys, the golden glow around the Parthenon's base. That night, back at the pension, I unpacked the slender volume of my travel journal and tried to sketch the rooftop view, shaky lines capturing the silhouette of ancient ruins. Rosalie peeked over my shoulder and tweaked a curve here, a shadow there, teaching me to look not just at what I saw, but at how I saw. I realized she had done more than show me hidden alleys. She had taught me to notice life's details again, to savor every flavor, every texture of this borrowed world. Before we parted the next morning, Rosalie was off to Delphi. I felt a pang of sadness. I realized how rare it was to meet someone who could see you without prejudice, who could reflect back parts of yourself you thought lost. We exchanged addresses and promised to write. When I hugged her goodbye, her silver hair brushing my cheek, her arms were warm and steady. As I watched her figure recede down the cobbled street, I felt the silence I had once feared now carry a new promise that I was never truly alone, that friendship could bloom in the most unexpected places, and that even in solitude, companionship waits. I turned back to the pension, the citadel of my new world, and felt braver than I had expected. In the days that followed, I carried her lessons with me, to walk slower, to look closer, to savor each olive, each melody in the alley, each breath of jasmine-drenched air. And whenever doubt flickered a momentary brush of loneliness, I remembered Rosalie's sharp gaze and her steadfast refusal to let beauty slip by unnoticed. In her quiet company, I rediscovered the joy of curiosity, the simple delight of shared wonder. And Athens, in its ancient sunlit glory, felt less like a distant dream and more like home. The morning light in Athens was soft and hazy when Rosalie burst into my room, eyes bright and restless. "Today," she declared, "we crossed the sea. We wheeled our suitcases through the early city, caught the metro, and made our way to Piraeus. The harbor sparkled with ferries and fishing boats, and we boarded the one headed for the narrow peninsula of Anaphiotica, a hidden corner draped in whitewashed houses and bougainvillea. Our shoes clacked on the uneven steps as we climbed into that labyrinth of alleys, so steeped in sunlight it felt like walking inside a shell of brilliance. We paused at every turn, a pale blue door with a tiny brass knocker, a tomato vine sculpted around a crack in the stucco, an orange tree whose limbs reached out over a rooftop terrace. Rosalie sketched a slanted rooftop in her notebook, then handed me her pencil. My own drawing trembled with excitement, an archway adorned with the lightest shade of cerulean. I still couldn't draw well, but that didn't matter. In that maze, looking closely was its own reward. By late morning, we were back on the ferry, wheeling through waves that caught the sunlight in a million flickers. We disembarked at the port of Naples, whisked through customs, and boarded a train south to Florence, our shared impulse to leap across borders, unplanned but irresistible. As the train rumbled north, I leaned against the window and watched olive groves blur into vineyards and vineyards into rolling hills dotted with cypress trees and stone farmhouses. We arrived in Florence as dusk was fading, the red tile roofs glowing like embers under the sky's pale flame. We wheeled our bags through cobblestone streets until we found our pension near the Duomo's soaring dome. Stepping from the narrow alley into the square, I felt as though I'd walked into a cathedral of air. The Duomo's marble facade glowed in twilight, every carved figure and geometric stripe silhouetted against the sky. I gasped, breath catching, and Rosalie simply smiled. That, she said, is devotion frozen in stone. We wandered the square, slipping into a trattoria tucked beneath the cathedral's shadow. The waiter, clad in crisp white, invited us inside where tables were set with plain linen and earthenware bowls. I ordered a plate of pappardelle al ragu and a small jug of Chianti. As I twirled the silky ribbons of pasta around my fork, I closed my eyes and let the rich flavors, a slow-cooked symphony of meat, tomato, and wine, anchor me to the present. After dinner, we followed the lantern-lit path along the Arno River, crossing the Ponte Vecchio, crowded with jewelers and artisans. I paused at a window display where silver earrings caught the glow of the street lamps. They were delicate tiny scales of hammered metal that glimmered like fish catching the moon's reflection. I slipped them on and they tinkled softly as I turned to Rosalie. "You look like someone who has permission to shine," she said, as though she had known me in another life. The next morning, we boarded another train, this time to Seville, our final leap into Andalusia's sun-baked embrace. I unfolded my scarf into a headband, feeling its yellow threads catch the light in just the right way. Outside the window, the landscape changed to ochre fields and whitewashed villages punctuated by the terracotta towers of distant olive groves. When we arrived, the heat was immediate, as though the very air was lit from within. Seville welcomed us with a riot of colors, the Alcázar's tiled courtyards, the Giralda Towers' intricate brickwork, the orange trees lining hidden patios. We wandered through the narrow streets of Santa Cruz, pausing at shaded plazas, where fountains murmured and locals murmured back in lilting Spanish. Many faces passed by, none paying us any heed, just two women drifting under the sun, taking up our own quiet space. We found a small restaurant recommended by a local guidebook, no English on the menu. White linen tables draped in lace rose petals strewn along the windowsill. We sat beneath paper lanterns and ordered gazpacho and jamón ibérico. The waiter sliced the ham paper thin, and I marveled at the smoky sweetness, the way it melted against the sharp coolness of the tomato soup. I had never tasted anything so unapologetically sumptuous. Between courses, Rosalie leaned forward. "Helen," she said, voice low, "push your boundaries. Do the thing that scares you." I blinked momentarily, startled by the earnest depth in her eyes, and she nodded toward the adjacent courtyard, where a small group of dancers practiced flamenco steps on a raised wooden platform. Their heels tapped the floor in sharp staccato skirts blossoming like flowers, arms curving skyward. I swallowed. I'd never danced anything but around the kitchen to comfort my grandchildren, steps so small no one noticed. But the impulse rose inside me, a pull toward that wooden stage, like memory pulling on a face I'd forgotten. Rosalie slipped out of her chair and offered her hand. "Come on," she said. "You belong there." I rose, wobbling slightly on the uneven floor, then followed her into the courtyard. The dancers paused at our arrival, then resumed in a slower rhythm. The music guitar and castanets and soulful voices wrapped around me, a living thing that beckoned. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and let my feet find a rhythm. My first steps were a cautious, half shuffle, half hesitant wobble, but with every tap I felt something loosen like a rusted lock. Rosalie's hand steadied me. We moved together, not in perfect harmony, but in shared bravery. Other patrons gathered at the courtyard's edge, some clapping softly to encourage others simply watching. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, embarrassment fluttering for a moment, but I let the rhythm carry it away. I swung one arm wide, then the other, circling slowly, the yellow scarf catching the lamplight. My heels tapped with more confidence, my body curving, as though the dance had been waiting inside me all along. When the music slowed, the dancer leading the group gave me a nod, as though welcoming me into that secret world. I met his gaze, felt the pulse of possibility. Rosalie and I finished our dance to the last note of guitar, and the courtyard erupted in gentle applause. I bowed a wild grin, splitting my face, and returned to our table where the waiter poured us wine with a knowing smile. That night in our pension's courtyard, we sipped glasses under a fringe of orange blossoms. Seville's heat had softened into a warm glow, the cobbles still radiating the day's sun. I traced the shape of my earring, the glint of silver against my skin, and felt the thrill of boundaries stretched and then shed. In Athens, I had walked ancient streets. In Florence, I marveled at stone and color. Here, I danced with strangers under the stars. Each city demanded no apology for its beauty. I too was allowed to take up space without excuse. As I closed my eyes, I felt the echo of that flamenco rhythm in my bones, a sharp, steady heartbeat that reminded me I belonged wherever I chose to stand. The world's beauty had no age limit, and neither did my right to move among it. With Rosalie's steady hand and the circle of strangers who lifted me with applause, I reclaimed something more precious than a ticket or a passport, the unshakable knowledge that my life was still unfolding step by step, beat by beat, in a grand dance without end. I woke before dawn to the distant clatter of shutters swinging open across the courtyard warmed by the first glow of early October light. The soft hum of Seville's awakening drifted up through my window, muffled footsteps on cobblestones, the faint bark of a dog greeting daybreak, a church bell tolling somewhere in the distance. I lay in bed a moment longer, savoring the hush before the world fully stirred, then slipped out of the cotton nightgown I'd bought in Lisbon and dressed in the simple linen blouse and slacks I'd packed for roaming. When I reached for my phone on the bedside table, it buzzed insistently again. The screen lit up with my son's name, then my daughter-in-law's. Then again. 4 missed calls, 6 texts, a voicemail. I picked it up, thumb hovering over the voicemail icon, and felt a curious tug of reluctance. Outside, the morning air beckoned. Inside, the messages waited like ghosts, demanding to be seen. I pressed the power button and the screen went dark. The phone's silent weight in my hand was strangely comforting, as though it understood that today I was in no hurry to explain myself. I slipped it back under my pillow, then padded across the cool stone floor to the window. The orange trees below bore fruit heavier than the branches, and their scent rose in gentle waves. For a moment, I simply breathed in that perfume of blossom and sun, letting my pulse find the city's slow heartbeat. Downstairs, the guest house owner prepared a simple breakfast of fresh bread, quince jam, and café con leche. Rosalie joined me at the small round table, already chatting with the owner about the day's market. I smiled at her, but she caught my eye and tilted her head toward the chair beside mine. I shook my head, half apologetic, half defiant, and she nodded in understanding. Over breakfast, she spoke of lavender fields in Provence, of a small chapel in Tuscany, of a hidden fishing village in Sicily. Her voice was easy, unhurried, and I listened to her as though she were reading poetry. When she finished, she smiled and picked up her cup. "Your turn," she said gently. I hesitated, then set down my croissant. I have to remain off the grid a bit longer, I admitted, but I promise I'll tell you everything when I'm ready. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Take all the time you need, she said. Silence can be its own kind of strength. And with that, she rose to fetch a second cup of coffee, leaving me to my thoughts. Outside, the city street began to hum. Stallholders arranged crates of oranges and peppers, their bright colors gleaming in the morning sun. I slipped my hand into my purse and felt the smooth coolness of my passport, a talisman that reminded me how far I'd already traveled from the woman who once felt she had no place in her own world. The morning unfolded around me as I wandered through the Plaza de España's neo-Moorish arches, tracing the intricate tile murals with my fingertips, each one telling a story of a Spanish province I'd never heard of before. I thought of the messages waiting on my phone, worrying, perhaps even panicked. I imagined my son's voice trembling with concern, my daughter-in-law's apologetic pleas. But here, in this sunlit expanse of tiled pathways and fountain mists, I felt an unexpected clarity. Their silence, or rather, my chosen silence, was not a retreat born of anger, but a declaration of my own borders. I paused at the edge of the water, watching a pair of ducks slice through the reflections of the arches. My mind drifted back to every time I'd called home, voice cracking, begging for acknowledgement, when birthdays passed without note, when holidays arrived with my seat already occupied by an extra chair for friend or neighbor. Each unanswered plea had stung, but I had learned to swallow that sting, to tuck it away beneath my apron and my quiet compliance. Today, I realized I was practicing a different lesson. I was honoring the value of my own stillness. In Seville, I had danced in a courtyard under lantern light. I had sipped olive oil-drizzled gazpacho in a hidden bodega. I had painted my way through Florence and lost myself in Anafiotica's whitewashed alleys. Each step had pushed me farther from the obligations I'd carried for decades, giving me space to discover that my presence did not exist merely for the comfort of others. Now, allowing the messages to pile up unanswered was simply another way of drawing boundaries. By midday, I found a small cafe shaded by lemon trees. I ordered a glass of fino sherry and a plate of jamón ibérico, savoring each whisper of flavor as though I were tasting freedom itself. A gentle breeze stirred the tablecloth, and I watched the busy market through slats of wrought iron. My phone lay silent on the table, a rectangle of possibility I chose to ignore. Instead, I let the world move around me, the bustle of locals, bargaining, the chatter of children at play, the distant laughter of friends, embracing in reunion. When the waiter cleared my plate, I tipped my glass to him in silent thanks for hospitality, for solitude, and for a lesson long overdue that silence can be its own answer. I rose and slipped my phone back into my pocket, its screen still dark. With each unreturned call, I was reclaiming a piece of myself that had been lost in the background noise of others' expectations. Later, on a terrace overlooking the Guadalquivir River, I ran my fingers along the spine of my journal. Rosalie had begun a new sketch of the cathedral, its bell tower reaching like a spire into the sky, and I felt the old impulse to document, to narrate, to share. But instead, I simply closed the book and let the river's slow current carry my thoughts away. I realized then that the strongest answer I could offer was not a flurry of words or tearful explanations, but the quiet power of my own resolve. By evening, as the city's lights blinked on and the air cooled, I returned to the pension. My phone buzzed, once a text, this time, "Mom, I'm worried. Please, call." I picked it up, looked at the message, then turned off the screen again. I laid it on the dresser, its glow extinguished like a refused invitation. In that deliberate act, I felt no guilt, only a solid knowing that I was no longer the woman who waited anxiously for permission to belong. When Rosalie returned from her afternoon walk, she found me on the rooftop terrace, watching sunset paint. The rooftops rose and gold. She didn't ask for news. She simply handed me a glass of wine, and we watched the horizon together, comfortable in each other's quiet. Below us, the city murmured on into the night. Above us, the first stars began to shimmer. and in that gentle pause, listening to the river's distant flow, breathing in the scent of orange blossoms and dusk, I understood that sometimes the most profound presence is the one that speaks through silence. Because in that stillness, I held my ground. I honored my worth. And I offered the strongest answer of all, that I would no longer shrink to fit anyone else's expectations. The dawn in Lisbon was gentle, the kind that tiptoes in on soft winds carrying salt from the Tagus. I woke early in the guest house, its blue shutters flung open to let the morning in and stretched on the crisp white sheets. The previous night's adventures still pulsed in my limbs, the flamenco rhythms of Seville, the riot of orange trees and shadowed alleys. But this morning felt different, quieter. Something about the pale Portuguese light made me feel as though the world had paused just for me. I brewed a pot of tea, green perfumed with mint, and carried my cup out onto the small balcony where laundry lines crisscrossed between terracotta rooftops. Below, the city was stirring shopkeepers at their doorways, a lone baker wheeling a cart of fresh pastries down the street, the distant toll of a church bell. I inhaled deeply, letting the scent of warming stone and jasmine drift over me. When I returned inside, a crisp envelope caught my eye on the nightstand. No stamp, but my name, Helen Wexler, was written in familiar handwriting. My heart stuttered as I recognized Laura's looping script. It had been weeks since I'd heard from home. I had allowed their calls to go unanswered, their texts to pile up in a silent testament to my new boundaries. Yet here was Laura's letter arriving in Lisbon as though it had chased me halfway across Europe. I slid my finger under the seal and unfolded the paper. The room's hush amplified the rustle of the parchment. Her words came in a single, unbroken passage, earnest and unadorned. Dear Mom, we've talked in circles since you left, trying to find the right words. We feared your age would hold you back, that you'd be too tired, too fragile. It never occurred to us that what kept you behind was our own fear, not yours. We're sorry we treated you like you needed our permission to live your life. We miss you every day, and we'd like to start again. No plans, no expectations, just you as you are invited back to our table whenever you choose. You don't have to fix anything or cook anything. We want you for yourself. If you can find it in your heart to forgive us, I promise we'll listen this time. Love, Laura. My breath came in a gust. The tears I'd held at bay since that morning in the driveway pooled and then tipped over. I sank into the chair by the window, the Lisbon light spilling around me as if blessing this fragile, beautiful apology. I thought of every moment I'd waited for recognition, birthdays, unmarked holidays, overlooked the basement grousing that Grandma's too old to make the 5-hour trip. Each unspoken hurt crystallized in that single line. It never occurred to us that what kept you behind was our own fear, not yours. The admission stung, but it was a welcome ache, honest rather than dismissive. I reached down to my travel bag and pulled out the envelope of their plane tickets I'd saved back in Athens. 4 sturdy cards still unclipped from each other, Athens' unstamped blank space where my name had been. I held that envelope in my hands, its crinkled edges a testament to how easily I'd been erased. I pressed it against my chest and closed my eyes, feeling the solidity of my own return. Laura's letter lay open on my lap, and I read it again, tasting the relief in every word. They were reaching across the miles, across my silence, across their own short-sightedness, to ask for a fresh beginning. It wasn't enough to erase the pain of being left behind, but it pointed towards something like redemption. A chance to sit at their table as a person, not as a ghost or a convenience. I set the tickets beside me and leaned my head back, letting the quiet of Lisbon wrap around me. I thought of the morning I'd set out from home, the locked door and the neighbor's promise to water my plants. I remembered the hush of the airport, the click of the boarding pass scanner, the deep hum of the engines that carried me to Athens, then Florence, then Seville, And now here across one sea and two borders, standing in a room filled with golden light and possibility. I rose and walked to the small desk beneath the window, pulling a fresh sheet of paper from my journal. My hand trembled only for a moment before I began to write Dear Laura and Greg. Thank you for finding the courage to say what needed to be said. I received your letter in Lisbon of all places, and it brought tears and a fierce relief. I forgive you not for the sake of forgetting, but so we can begin again honestly, without old shadows lingering at the door. I am not the woman you left behind, and I am no longer the woman you once thought you knew. I will return when I am ready, but know this, I will come back on my own terms. With love, Helen. I read the letter over, adjusted a phrase here and there, then folded it and tucked it into an envelope. No need for fancy stationery. The weight of my words was enough. As I sealed it, I felt a sense of closure ripple through me. The letters that rose unanswered had carried their own gravity. This one carried the promise of change. I stepped back onto the balcony, crisp envelope in hand, and watched the city's rooftops glow in the late morning sun. The letter would find its way back home, carried by post, to the house they once told me to watch. They would read it and feel the weight of my journey, the evidence of their own oversight, and the resolute spirit I had rediscovered. Below, Lisbon's streets thrummed with life trams clattering along tracks, cafe patrons chatting over espressos, vendors whooping out pastry specials. In that moment, I belonged to all of it and none of it. I belonged to myself. I had crossed oceans and courtyards, danced under lanterns, and sketched in hidden alleys. I had learned that beauty and courage demand no apology, and that sometimes the strongest answer is to hold your ground in stillness until the world finally pauses to listen. I held Laura's letter and the ticket's envelope close, feeling their words and their emptiness, both as evidence of my erasure and my return. In the hush of Lisbon's morning, I realized I was no longer waiting for permission to exist in the fullness of my own life. And as the sun rose higher, I felt the soft swell of a heart, unburdened, ready to carry this new beginning home whenever I chose to return. The night air in Seville held a heady promise as Rosalie and I wound our way through narrow streets, the clack of my sandals echoing off the orange-hued walls. We rounded a corner and found ourselves before a converted warehouse, its industrial facade softened by strands of fairy lights and a weathered wooden sign that read simply La Noche. A low thrum of music pulsed through the open doorway, beckoning us inside. I paused at the threshold, catching a glimpse of the interior, a cavernous space ringed with exposed brick and iron beams, the center cleared for dancing. A haze of lantern smoke drifted lazily under the rafters, swirling between clusters of dancers, whose silhouettes moved with effortless grace. At one end, a trio of musicians coaxed fiery rhythms from guitar, violin, and hand drum sounds that rippled through my chest like a living heartbeat. Rosalie squeezed my hand. Tonight, she said, her eyes glinting, we dance. I gripped my yellow scarf and wrapped it around my head, knotting it at the nape of my neck. The color felt audacious in the dim light, a flare of sunshine against my hair. I smoothed my cotton dress, drew a deep breath, and stepped onto the wooden floor. At first, my feet felt heavy as though they carried the weight of decades of hesitancy. But with each note, each strum of guitar and flourish of violin, the floor seemed to pulse like an invitation. A woman spun past me in a swirl of skirts, her laughter blending with the music, and I felt a spark ignite in my belly. I closed my eyes and let my arms drop to my sides, letting the beat guide my steps. My first moves were tentative, a simple sway, a half turn, my toes tapping the boards. I imagined my husband's hands teaching me to waltz in our living room, his gentle guidance long ago, and I smiled against my own surprise. The music deepened, rolling like waves, and I folded my arms, lifted one heel, then the other, discovering a rhythm that seemed to belong to a version of me I'd almost forgotten. In that moment, I was neither grandmother nor caretaker. I was simply a woman moving with the music, unburdened by roles or responsibilities. I opened my eyes and saw Rosalie standing a few feet away, her silver hair a halo in the lantern glow. She beckoned with a single finger, and I walked toward her, both of us laughing at how ridiculous and exhilarating it felt. Together we spun in wide circles, the hem of my dress brushing the floor, our laughter churning light through the smoke. Rosalie caught my wrist, her grip strong and unhesitating, and we moved as one step, syncopated arms, linked hearts pounding in unison. The dancers around us paused for a moment, clapping to the beat and cheering us on. I didn't look at them. Instead, I kept my gaze on Rosalie, finding in her steady presence the permission to be entirely myself. The music built to a crescendo, drums pounding strings, screaming in harmony, and as the final notes rang out, we collapsed into giggles, breathless and flushed. My knees ached, a dull reminder of muscles unused to such movement, but the ache was a badge of courage. I clutched my scarf and let the sweat on my forehead mingle with the salt of that ache, each pulse a testament to the life surging back through me. We retreated to the edge of the dance floor and sank onto a wooden bench where the bartender in a crisp black vest poured us 2 small glasses of sherry. The liquid was sharp and sweet, a perfect counterpoint to the warm haze settling in my chest. I lifted the glass in a silent toast, to the music, to this place, to the yellow scarf that felt like my own miniature sun. Rosalie leaned forward, her voice a hush, even above the murmurs of the remaining dancers. "You did it," she said. "I saw you carving space for yourself in that chaos." I nodded, the sherry's warmth dancing down my throat. I forgot how much joy could look like this, like reckless laughter and stumbling steps. Her eyes softened, and for a moment I saw the reflection of my own surprise in them, as though she too had rediscovered something she thought lost. We raised our glasses again, clinking them lightly before taking another sip. As the evening wore on, we lingered in that corner, watching the others drift back onto the floor in smaller, more practiced groups. A man in his 60s led a woman my age in a slow tango, their faces fierce with concentration. A group of friends laughed in a circle, arms around each other, spinning until they had to stabilize themselves on their heels. Each pair, each cluster, wove stories through their movement, stories of love, loss, friendship, defiance. By the time Rosalie nudged me, suggesting we head back, the warehouse felt like a sanctuary rather than a stage. We stepped into the cool night, the hush of Seville's streets, a soft after-song to the music's roar. My knees were stiff, each step a reminder of the night's freedom, but I welcomed the ache. It was proof that I had let myself feel something raw and unguarded. Back at the pension, I peeled off the yellow scarf and laid it gently on the bedside table. I washed my face and hands, the cool water chasing away the last traces of sweat. In the mirror, my reflection looked older, lines etched deeper by both years and laughter, but my eyes glowed with an almost wild spark. I touched my cheek, half expecting to feel traces of powder, but there was only the warmth left by the night's abandon. I sank onto the edge of the bed, feet dangling, and let the room's hush wrap around me. Outside, the distant shouts of late revelers drifted through the window, mingling with the soft clank of shutters closing. Inside, my heart beat a slow, steady rhythm, like the last echo of a flamenco drum. I thought of the woman I had been before this trip, quiet, deferential, defined by the needs of others, and I felt a tender compassion for her. She had offered everything she had until there was almost nothing left for herself. But this new woman with flourished steps under the Spanish stars had reclaimed something crucial, the knowledge that joy needs no apology, that defiance can be danced. Lying back, I closed my eyes and whispered a thank you to Seville, its fiery rhythms, its open-hearted nights, its willingness to let an older woman claim the floor. I drifted to sleep with the remnant of music still pulsing in my veins, knowing that my knees would ache tomorrow, but that my spirit would remain light forever, marked by that reckless dance in defiance of all the voices that once told me to sit quietly in the shadows. When I stepped from the cab onto my front porch, the air felt different, familiar. Yes, but also charged with the echo of all the places I'd been. The key turned in the lock with a satisfying click, and I crossed the threshold carrying my suitcase and a quiet determination. The house smelled the same lavender polish on the floors, faint echo of jasmine in the hallway, but I walked through the rooms like someone who had rediscovered her own story. My footsteps were soft on the rugs I'd selected years ago, and each corner seemed to whisper a welcome I'd never fully heard before. In the living room, I paused by the mantel where Paul's photograph still stood. I reached out and touched the silver frame, felt its cool metal beneath my fingertips. Hearing Athens, Florence, Seville, Lisbon, in its patina somehow made the image brighter. His smile a reminder that love doesn't fade just because the world moves on. I left the suitcase in the entry hall and padded barefoot into the kitchen, where I set down a small vase of daisies Rosalie had given me before she left for Marseille. I arranged them with care, their white petals opening like quiet invitations. The house felt deliciously empty, no ringing phone, no clamor of voices. I took a deep breath and poured myself a glass of water, savoring the routine of filling a cup, the physicality of it, after so much travel. I didn't check my messages. I didn't rush to unpack or reorient. Instead, I let the silence settle in around me, a testament to beds unmade by someone else's scheduled dinners, unplanned by someone else's needs. At 73, I had earned the right to a slow return. As I moved through the dining room, tracing the edges of the table where countless family gatherings once unfolded, I felt a soft thrill. This time it would be different. I imagined myself setting a new scene here, one defined by honesty rather than obligation. On the sideboard, I spotted the untouched envelope I'd tucked away with Laura's letter. I carried it to the desk by the window, placed it alongside the canceled plane tickets, and watched the afternoon light play over the paper. Proof of erasure and return side by side. A soft knock at the front door pulled me from my reverie. I smiled, stepping toward the sound with surprising eagerness. Through the peephole, I saw Amelia, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her ever-changing hair color caught in the sun. When I opened the door, she beamed up at me, that mixture of teen uncertainty and sheer delight lighting her face. "Grandma," she cried, her voice bright as tangerine. She tossed her bag down without waiting and threw her arms around me. I held her close, inhaling the scent of her shampoo and youth, and felt a wave of tenderness wash over me. She pulled back, eyes shining with curiosity. "I have something to show you," she said, breathless. She bounded over to the living room table, rifling through her backpack, and pulled out a small spiral notebook. I made a list. She tapped the cover. We both laughed at how earnest that sounded. She opened to the first page and began to read aloud, voice gaining confidence with each line. "Things I refuse to inherit, quietly, one silence when I need to speak up. 2. The idea that aging means disappearing. 3. Letting others decide my worth without asking." As she read, I felt tears prick my eyes. Her words echoed my own realizations distilled by her youthful wisdom. When she finished, she looked at me with a grin, both proud and vulnerable. "I got inspiration from you," she said softly. I took the notebook in my hands, tracing the list, her rebellion against conformity, her insistence on being seen. I realized then that my journey had rippled outward, inspiring the next generation to claim their own space. Before I could say anything, there was another knock, this one calmer, more measured. Amelia beamed and called, "It's Mom and Dad." At the doorway stood David and Laura, somewhat apprehensive but determined. They carried a box of tea and a small plate of cookies, gestures of reconciliation, however tentative. Laura stepped forward first, her eyes damp with unshed tears. "Hi, Mom," she said, voice trembling on the edge of apology. "We brought tea." "If that's okay." I nodded and stepped aside. David followed her, and looking older, his shoulders weighed with regret and hope. I closed the door behind them and led them to the dining table as Amelia darted off to fetch her notebook. Laura placed the tea box in the middle of the table, 3 blends, 1 for each of us. I unwrapped the cookies and offered them a seat. We sat down, and for a long moment, none of us spoke. The quiet hung between us like thick velvet, but it carried no bitterness, only possibility. Finally, Laura cleared her throat. I've read your letter 3 times, she said, her voice small. And I'm so sorry for the mess we made of things. She looked at David, who nodded, then back at me. We don't expect you to fix everything. We just want to listen. I poured hot water into the teapot, the steam rising like a gentle promise. Thank you, I said, letting the words fill the silence. This tea tastes better when it's shared. David reached out and placed a tentative hand over mine. I miss you, Mom, he said, meeting my eyes. I didn't know how to say it before. I felt warmth in my chest, the warmth of his words, of this moment of mutual vulnerability. I nodded and lifted my teacup. I missed you too, I replied. But I had to learn how to miss myself first. We drank in silence for a few sips, the tea's calming notes weaving comfort through the room. Laura glanced at Amelia's list, then at the empty envelope of plane tickets and the letter tucked beside it. She reached out, folding her fingers around the letter, and drew in a breath as though finding her courage all over again. I understand if you need time, she said. I just hope we can start with small steps. Maybe weekend visits. No fuss, just us, I smiled, feeling the weight of years lift. That sounds perfect, I said. Small steps. Amelia bounded back into the room, her notebook open to the next page, things I will always celebrate. She read a few lines, curiosity, laughter, family stories that never get old, and her voice filled the room with bright energy. We settled into easy conversation then, like a river finding its new course after a long drought. David talked about the kids' school plays, Laura about her new gardening hobby, and Amelia described her art class assignments. I shared stories from my travels, the hidden alleys of Anafiotica, the dance floor in Seville, the hush of Lisbon mornings. They listened, eyes wide nodding, as if discovering me anew. When the afternoon sun fell into golden slanting beams, we moved to the living room, teacups in hand, blankets draped over laps. I noticed the way Laura's shoulders had relaxed, the way David's gaze lingered on my face without expectation. In that quiet return, I realized that home could be a place of renewal rather than routine. Later, as they left, promising to return next weekend, I stood in the entryway with Amelia at my side. I kissed her forehead and watched her hurry down the steps, her laughter trailing behind like a kite's tail. Then I closed the door on David and Laura, their goodbyes soft and sincere. Alone again, I walked through the familiar rooms, each one now freshly alive with possibility. Paul's photograph on the mantel seemed to smile in approval. The daisies winked from their vase, bright as hope. I picked up Amelia's notebook and traced her list, feeling the pulse of family reimagined. I sank into the armchair by the window, poured the last cup of tea into my favorite mug, and listened to the sudden hush of the house. In that moment, I understood that the quiet return was not an end, but a beginning, a gentle reclaiming of relationships, one teacup and one kind word at a time. And as the day slipped softly into evening, I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, the scent of fresh beginnings and the quiet strength of home rediscovered. I couldn't sleep that night, though I tried. The day had been full of laughter over tea with Laura and David, of Amelia's bright-eyed chatter, of the comforting hush of home rediscovered. But after everyone left, I found myself once more in my favorite armchair by the window, my journal open in my lap. The Lisbon sun had faded to dusk when I lit a single candle on the side table. Its flame flickered gently, matching the quiet flame that had been kindled inside me these past weeks. I picked up my pen and stared at the blank page, feeling its soft weight beneath my fingers. The room smelled of lavender polish and old wood, and beyond the glass I could just see the silhouettes of orange trees in the courtyard, their leaves hushed in the approaching night. I allowed my mind to drift back through the journey I'd taken from that cool morning on the front porch when they drove off without me, to the hush of Gate C12, to dancing in defiance in Seville's lantern-lit warehouse, to meeting Rosalie and laughing under vine-draped terraces. Each moment had led me here to this quiet return. I began to write, not as a letter to anyone, but as a declaration to myself, my final truths, the ones I had learned and refused to unlearn. I will not apologize for wanting space. I will not wait for invitations to enter my own life. I will leave the window seat empty beside me. My coat will stay unfolded, a banner of my belonging. Each breath I take is permission granted. Every seat at every table is mine to claim always. I paused to let each phrase settle, watching the candle's reflection in the polished table surface. The words felt solid, as real as the leather binding of my journal, as unshakable as the Parthenon's pillars I'd admired in Athens. No longer would I shrink to the margins or tiptoe around the spaces others deemed mine. I had trudged through hidden alleys and grand piazzas, danced beneath foreign stars, and returned with the knowledge that my voice, my presence, my very breath had irrevocable value. I closed my journal and touched the cover, still warm from my palm. Outside, the city's hum softened to a whisper as midnight approached. I stood and padded across the tile floor to the hallway closet where my navy coat still hung beside the scarf I'd tied in Seville. I pulled it free and draped it over the back of a chair, deliberately leaving it unfolded, a signal that I could walk out that door at any moment, a silent promise to myself that no return note would be required. I thought about the next flight I might take to Granada with its winding streets and Alhambra's moonlit courts, or perhaps beyond to Porto's riverside wine tasting, or Vienna's grand cafes. When that day came, I would board the plane with my passport in hand and my boarding pass ready, choosing the window or the aisle without hesitation. I would slide into the empty seat next to me, the one no one claimed, and cast my coat across the armrest. I would breathe deeply, tasting the freedom that comes with self-invitation. In the bedroom, I set my journal on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. The single candle's last glow lingered in the living room, a beacon of what I had found: clarity, courage, and the unassailable right to belong. As I slipped beneath the covers, my knees ached softly from that reckless dance in Seville, a small price for the joy I had reclaimed. I smiled, remembering the tin of olives in Athens, the tattered pages of Rosalie's sketchbook, the wild beat of flamenco tapping in my chest. I closed my eyes, feeling the gentle hush of the house and the secure warmth of my own resolve. No more apologies would slip past my lips for daring to carve out my own path. No more waiting by phone screens for texts that might never come. No more second-guessing my worth when invitations never arrived. Instead, I would greet each morning with an open map, my own map, dotted with places I yearned to see, and each evening with the satisfaction of having claimed my own space in the world. Somewhere in the quiet night, I imagined Rosalie crossing a bridge in Marseille, humming our shared tune. I pictured Amelia at her desk, adding to her list of defiant truths. I pictured Laura and David sipping their tea in my kitchen, learning how to offer their mother not just comfort, but genuine partnership. And I pictured myself on another plane, my yellow scarf fluttering like a banner of independence, my coat unfurled beside me like a silent cheer. That I realized as sleep finally claimed me was what true freedom looked like: the confidence to step forward without permission, the grace to occupy space without apology, the joy of knowing that wherever I went, the seat was already mine. And in that final thought, so simple, so radiant, I felt a peace I had carried home from every hidden alley and every high rooftop. Tomorrow would come with its own sunrise, its own promises to fill. But tonight, I rested in the certainty that my journey would always be mine to define, and that every seat, every path, every horizon belonged to me always.